just past midnight, and the snow on the ridge had stopped falling. Private Zhang Wenbin of the People's Volunteer Army came up the reverse slope in the second wave, and the thing he noticed first was the silence. The American guns that had hammered the approach for 2 hours were quiet now. Ahead, where the enemy line was supposed to be, nothing moved. His squad leader had told them the outpost was finished, that the first wave had rolled over it, that all they had to do was walk up and occupy the wreckage. So he walked. His padded boots broke through a crust of ice into the powder underneath, and the sound seemed enormous in the stillness. He could smell burnt cordite and something sweeter underneath it, the smell of churned earth thrown up by shell fire. To his left and right, dark shapes of men moved forward at a crouch, rifles slung, expecting to gather prisoners rather than fight for the crest. The assessment coming down from his company was simple and, on the face of it, reasonable. Every American position on this finger of ground had gone silent, one after another, over the past 40 minutes. A silent hole was a dead one, or a captured one. If your father or your grandfather held a hole in the ground on a frozen Korean ridge and lived to tell about it, or never got the chance to, this channel exists to tell what men like him did. So subscribe, hit the like button, and put his name and his unit in the comments, because those names belong in the record. Now back to the ridge, and to the one thing the Chinese assessment got wrong. One position on that crest was neither dead nor taken, and Zhang Wenbin was walking straight toward it. The muzzle flash, when it came, was a single hard tongue of light no more than 30 yards up the slope, and it did not stop. It swept. The man in that hole was firing controlled bursts across the front, traversing left, then right, then back, and the snow around Zhang erupted in small black geysers as rounds walked through the advancing line. The soldier beside him dropped without a word. Zhang went flat into the powder and pressed his face against the cold and tried to make sense of what his ears were telling him, because the tempo was wrong. A single rifleman fires and pauses to work the bolt. A machine gun team is 2 men, sometimes 3, and it announces itself with weight. This was neither. The fire came too fast for one bolt action man, and too steady, too disciplined, for a panicked survivor emptying a magazine into the dark. It came from exactly one point on the hill, one hole, one weapon. And it should not have been there, because the position that hole belonged to had stopped answering American calls a long time ago. Here is the part that the People's Volunteer Army after-action men would have to reckon with in the days that followed, and I want to state it plainly before we go back and take it apart. Every fighting position on that outpost had fallen silent. The Chinese command read that silence as victory and fed a fresh wave into it. What they had actually collided with was a single American who had gone on holding his ground after the men to either side of him were gone, whose refusal to quit had turned one foxhole into the entire line, and whose fire was now breaking a battalion-strength assault against a hill that, by every reasonable measure, should already have belonged to Zhang Wenbin's regiment. So the question that runs under this whole story is not complicated. How does one hole hold what a company could not? To answer it, we have to go back to who was in that hole, what he was firing, and why the silence all around him was not what it looked like from the bottom of the slope. Zhang pressed lower and waited for the flash to sweep past him again. It came on schedule, left to right, right to left, a metronome of tracer and ice. Somewhere above him, a wounded man from the first wave was screaming into the snow. The American in the hole kept firing. The weapon in the hole was a Browning automatic rifle, 20 pounds of steel and walnut that a man carried across his chest like a grudge. Its magazine held 20 rounds. A trained man could burn through that in a little over 2 seconds if he let it run, and nobody who lived very long ever let it. You fired in bursts of 3 or 4. You counted in your head, and you changed magazines before the weapon went empty rather than after, because an empty gun on a night like this was a death sentence with a slow fuse. The BAR did not sweep the way a machine gun swept. A machine gun sat on a tripod and traversed on a smooth arc. This weapon was shouldered and swung by a man's own arms, and the fire that Zhang Wenbin heard climbing the slope had that quality to it, the ragged human rhythm of one set of lungs and one pair of hands doing the work of a crew. Inside the hole, it was cold, in a way that had stopped being a sensation and become a fact of the body. The temperature on the ridge that night sat below 0. A canteen left uninsulated froze solid. Men slept with them between their thighs to keep the water liquid. Tea, if you were lucky enough to have brewed any before the shooting started, went to slush in the cup and then to ice against the metal, and you drank the last of it as a cold syrup, or you did not drink it at all. The man in the hole had numb fingers, and numb fingers are the quiet enemy of a soldier who has to reload in the dark. Feel goes first. You cannot tell by touch whether the fresh magazine has seated until you hear the click, and if your gloves are on, you cannot work the release at all, and if your gloves are off, the metal of the weapon takes the skin off your fingertips and glues it to the steel. So he did what men in those holes did. He worked barehanded and fast, seated the magazine by sound and by the feel deep in the joint of his hand rather than the fingertip, and got the weapon back up before the next wave could close the distance he had bought with the last one. His breath came out in a fog that hung in front of his face and told anyone watching exactly where he was. Look at the plain arithmetic of that foxhole. 1 man, 1 automatic rifle, a finite number of magazines laid out on the frozen lip of the hole where he could reach them without looking, and a slope in front of him that kept producing more men than he had rounds. The cold worked against him. The dark worked for him and against him at once, hiding him from the Chinese and hiding them from him until they were close. Every burst gave away his position with that single tongue of flame, and every burst was also the only thing keeping the position his. He could not stop firing to stay hidden, because the moment he stopped, the silence would tell them he was finished. The same silence that had already sent Zhang's wave up the hill in the belief that the whole crest was dead. We do not, at this point in the story, know his name. That comes later, and it matters, and I am not going to hand it to you before the record does. What we know from the ground itself is the physics of the thing. A rifleman who keeps a disciplined rate of fire, who changes magazines by feel, who does not panic and empty the weapon in one long useless burst, can hold a frontage far wider than one man has any business holding, for as long as the ammunition lasts and the barrel does not cook. Sustained fire heats a barrel until accuracy falls off and the metal itself begins to fail, and the BAR had no quick-change barrel, no way to swap it out when it glowed. So the whole thing came down to a race he probably was not even aware he was running. It was ammunition against the dark and heat against the barrel, and it was one man's hands against the cold that was trying to take them. The mortar rounds had come first, before the infantry, walking down the ridgeline from the north, in a pattern that told you somebody on the Chinese side knew exactly where the American holes were. That was the thing that should have worried the outpost more than it did. The lineup here was a string of two-man positions strung along the military crest, each one sighted to see its neighbors, each one close enough to cover the ground between them with crossing fire. On paper, it was a fabric. Pull any single thread, and the others held the weight. The whole point of digging in that way was that no one hole ever had to fight alone. It started coming apart on the left. The northernmost position took the opening barrage and then the first rush, and for a few minutes it fired back the way it was supposed to, the tracers stitching down into the draw where the assault was forming. Then it stopped. Not tapered off. Stopped, between one burst and the next, the way a radio cuts when someone pulls the cord. The men in the next hole down heard it stop and understood what it meant, and they had about 90 seconds to think about it before the same wave that had swallowed their neighbors came for them. Down the line it went, position by position, and each collapse made the next one worse. The mechanism was simple. Every hole that fell silent was a hole that had been covering the ground in front of somebody else. When the left flank position died, the men to its right lost the fire that had been protecting their open side, and the Chinese assault teams simply walked into the dead space and rolled the line up from the flank like a man peeling tape. The fabric did not tear all at once. It unraveled, one thread pulling the next loose, and the direction of the unraveling was toward the center of the crest, toward one hole in particular that sat near the high point of the finger. By the time the collapse reached the middle of the ridge, the surviving Americans were fighting in three directions. A hole sighted to face north now had enemy to the north and the northwest, and worst of all, behind it, to the northeast, where the flank had already gone. There is a specific horror in hearing your own line die from the wrong direction, in listening to the fire that used to be beside you, now firing at you. Some of those positions were overrun in close work, grenade and bayonet, and the flat crack of pistols in the dark. Some were simply left behind, bypassed by an assault that had learned to flow around a strong point and cut it off rather than batter through it. The men in them ran out of ammunition, or the ammunition froze, or the two men in the hole were both hit, and there was no third man to keep the weapon up. Sources on the exact sequence conflict, and I am not going to pretend, to a precision, the record does not support. The after-action reconstruction of a night action on a small hill, assembled later from the handful of men who came off it, is never a clean timeline. What is not in dispute is the pattern. From the American side, it was a line dissolving from both flanks inward. From the Chinese side, climbing the slope, it looked like exactly what their commanders told them it was: an enemy position being systematically extinguished, hole by hole, the fire from the crest thinning as each strong point went dark. And here is where the two readings of that same silence diverge, and everything turns on the difference. The Chinese read a dying line and committed a fresh wave to finish it. What was actually happening was that the line had already died everywhere except one point, and at that one point, a single man had watched the positions to his left and right, and rear go quiet, understood he was now alone on the crest, and made the decision not to add his own silence to theirs. The fabric had one thread left. The whole weight of the assault was about to come down on it, and it did not let go. The voices came up out of the draw before the men did, and they were close enough now that he could tell them apart. Not shouted commands from down the slope where the officers were, but conversational, low. The flat exchange of men who thought the fighting near them was over and were talking about how to climb the last stretch of ice. He could not understand a word of it. He did not need to. The distance was the message. When you can hear the individual voices of the men coming to kill you, when you can hear one of them cough and another answer him, they are inside the range where a foxhole stops being a fighting position and becomes a hole in the ground with a man trapped at the bottom of it. His flanks were gone. The fire that used to answer from his left had been silent long enough that the snow was probably already settling on the men who had made it. Behind him, to the northeast, more voices. They were past him now, and the hole was not a line anymore, but an island. Every instinct a body owns was telling him one thing: get out. Go back over the reverse slope while there is still a reverse slope to go over. He did not, and the reason is worth being cold and exact about, because this is the hinge the whole night turns on. A man alone in a hole has fire pointing outward, and that fire is the only thing keeping the enemy at arm's length. The moment he climbs out to run, two things happen at once. The fire stops, and the silence tells them he is finished. The same silence that had already been misread all the way down the crest, and a man scrambling up out of a hole and over open ground in the dark with his back to 50 rifles is not a soldier anymore. He is a target moving against the snow, backlit by every muzzle flash behind him, running slower than a bullet has ever traveled. You cannot outrun men who are already level with you. You cannot outrun the ground itself, frozen and broken, that will put you on your face inside 10 strides. The math of running was worse than the math of staying, and staying was already close to hopeless. So the choice that looked like courage from the outside was, at the bottom of it, also the only choice with any arithmetic left in it. The hole was terrible. Everything outside the hole was worse. He stayed, and he kept the weapon working, and he did the one thing that kept the island from being swallowed. He kept the tempo irregular. A steady rhythm tells a listening enemy exactly when the next burst is coming and exactly when to move between them. He broke it. 2 rounds, a pause, 4 rounds, a longer pause, a single shot at a voice he thought he could place, then silence held just long enough to make them wonder before the next burst walked across the front. It kept the men in the draw from timing their rush. Every time a knot of them gathered nerve to come the last 30 yards, the flash swept back onto them and put them down or put them flat, and flat men do not take a crest. The cold that was stealing his fingers was also the thing hanging his breath in front of his face like a lantern, and he knew it, and he fired anyway, because the alternative to giving away his position was giving up his position. Somewhere in those minutes, the screaming from the first wave stopped. The record does not say whether the man died, or whether the cold simply took his voice. It says only that the fire from the hole did not stop. What broke in the end was not the man. It was the Chinese assumption. A wave sent up to occupy a corpse of a hill had walked into disciplined automatic fire from a point that was supposed to be dead, and it stalled on the slope, and stalled men on an open slope in the dark start to come apart. The voices that had been conversational got sharper, higher. The tone of men who have realized the situation they were briefed on is not the situation in front of them. One hole had rewritten what they thought they knew. 40 minutes. That was the window, near as anyone has reconstructed it. that a Chinese assault battalion allotted itself to take a small outpost line and be off the exposed forward slope before the American artillery found the range. Everything about the way they came up that hill was built around the clock. The mortars walking down the crest in a known pattern. The waves committed one behind the other rather than held in reserve. The assault teams trained to flow around a strong point instead of stopping to reduce it. All of it served a single master, and that master was time. They had to be over the crest and dug into the reverse slope before dawn and before the shells came, because a Chinese battalion caught in the open on a forward slope in daylight was not a battalion anymore. It was a casualty list. This was not recklessness. It was doctrine, and it was sound doctrine, forged against exactly the American advantage it was designed to outrun. The People's Volunteer Army had learned in its first year in Korea what American firepower did to massed men in the open. They could not match the guns. What they could do was move at night, close the distance before the artillery could be called, and win the fight inside the range, where American shells became as dangerous to the Americans as to them. The whole method depended on tempo. A night attack that ran on schedule overwhelmed a position before it could be reinforced and cleared the danger zone before the response arrived. A night attack that fell behind schedule got caught by the sunrise and the forward observers and died on the ground it had paid for. Speed was not an advantage they preferred. It was the only lever they had against a material superiority they could not otherwise touch. So look at what one hole did to that arithmetic. The plan had a line item for every position on the crest, and every line item assumed the same thing, that a strong point, once bypassed or rushed, would fall silent inside a minute or two, and the assault would flow past it. The timetable had no column for a single automatic rifle firing, in broken rhythm from a point that was supposed to be dead, stalling a fresh wave on the open slope, forcing the men behind to go to ground, and the officers to sort out why the crest was not yet theirs. Every minute that hole stayed alive was a minute subtracted from the 40, a minute closer to the sunrise and the shells, and there was no way to buy the minute back. You cannot compress the far end of a night attack. The dawn comes when it comes. Chinese accounts of these outpost fights, written up after the war in their own operational reviews, keep returning to the same failure, and they name it plainly. One post-battle analysis of the outpost fighting of that period recorded the lesson as a warning to their own commanders, that a single resisting bunker or firing point left unreduced could disrupt the entire timetable of the attack and expose the assault troops to enemy artillery at first light. That is their assessment, not mine. The men who wrote it were not paying a compliment to American courage. They were doing cold staff work, accounting for why attacks that should have succeeded on paper came apart on the ground. And the answer they kept writing down was that the plan had no slack in it, and a stubborn hole was slack the plan could not afford. That is the whole trap the man in the foxhole had stumbled into being without any way of knowing it. He was not thinking about the enemy's timetable. He was thinking about numb fingers and the next magazine and the voices in the draw. But the effect of his irregular fire was to attack the one resource the assault could not replace. It was not their men. They had men. And it was not their nerve, not yet. It was their time. He was spending their 40 minutes for them, a burst at a stretch, and the longer he made them spend, the closer the sky over the ridge came to going gray in the east, and with it, the observers who would turn that open slope into the thing every Chinese plan was built to avoid. On the high point of the finger, in a hole no wider than a bathtub, the fight had narrowed down to a stretch of ground, maybe 30 yards deep on the forward slope. The ridgeline, the outpost, the two-man positions strung out to either side. None of that was the fight anymore. Just that 30 yards, and the men trying to cross it, and the weapon that would not let them. They came in rushes, the way trained infantry comes, 3 or 4 men up and moving, while the others put fire on the hole to keep his head down. It was good technique. It should have worked. What it did not account for was that the man in the hole had stopped trying to survive and started trying to make them pay a price they had not budgeted for. When the covering fire came in, he stayed low, and when it lifted for the rush, he was already up, and the flash swept across the moving shapes before they had crossed half the ground. The lead men went down, the rest went flat, and flat men on a forward slope in the cold are men who are not taking the crest this minute, which was the only currency that mattered. Grenades came next when the rushes stopped working. That is the classic answer to a stubborn hole. You cannot walk up to it, so you throw the fight the last 20 yards through the air. In the dark, uphill, on ice, throwing a grenade far enough and accurately enough to drop it into a hole the size of a bathtub is not a thing that happens often. Most fell short and burst on the slope. Some went long. The concussions walked around him without finding him, and each one lit the ground for a half-second, white and flat, and in that half-second he could see them stacking up in the dead ground below, and he fired into where they would be when the light died. How many waves? The record does not agree with itself. Some accounts of these outpost actions describe 3 separate assaults on a single position across a night. Others compress the whole thing into one long grinding push that never quite stopped. I am not going to invent a number the sources will not give me. What the sources agree on is the shape of it, that the fire from that point on the crest did not slacken when it should have, did not stop when everything around it had stopped, and that men kept being sent against it and kept not taking it. There is a line from a veteran of that ridge, recorded years afterward, that I keep coming back to because it refuses to reach for anything grand. Asked why the man had not pulled back when the flanks went, he said only, "There wasn't any place back to go, so he stayed, and he shot." That is the whole thing, stripped of the medals and the citations. There was no line behind him to fall back on because he was the line. The reverse slope led to more Chinese. Staying was not nobler than leaving. Leaving had simply stopped being possible somewhere around the time the voices got close. The barrel was the enemy he could not fight. 20 pounds of steel firing round after round builds heat that has nowhere to go in the dark, and a Browning fired long enough will cook off and warp and finally jam, and there is no cover of darkness deep enough to hide a weapon that has quit. He nursed it. Short bursts, the pauses he was already using to break their timing, now doubling as the thing that kept the barrel from killing itself. The cold that was murdering his hands was, in the one cruel mercy of the night, pulling the heat off the steel between bursts, and the sky, somewhere out past the far ridge, was doing the one thing the Chinese timetable could not stop it from doing. It was beginning to go from black to the deep gray that comes before gray. Not light yet, but the promise of it. Every burst from the hole had spent another handful of their 40 minutes, and now the account was very nearly empty, and the men on the slope knew it before their officers would admit it. The hole was still firing when the dark started to thin. One hole was now doing the work of a rifle company. That is not a figure of speech, and it is worth sitting with for a second before the night resolves. The finger the man was holding sat at the hinge of the whole outpost line, the point where the crest bent and the ground fell away toward the draw the Chinese were using as their approach. Take that point, and the assault teams could turn along the ridge and roll up the two-man holes from the flank, one after another, the way you unzip a coat. That was the plan. The plan needed the finger, and the finger was still shooting. So the attack did what attacks do when the direct approach stops paying. It tried to go around. Men peeled off the stalled rush and worked left along the slope, hunting for the flank of the position, the dead angle where the fire could not reach. In daylight, against a fixed emplacement, they would have found it in minutes. But the fire was not coming from a fixed emplacement. It was coming from a man who kept shifting his weapon across the lip of the hole, and who had spent the whole night refusing to fire in a rhythm anyone could read. The flanking men could not find the edge of a beaten zone because there was no beaten zone, only bursts arriving from a point they could not fix, at intervals they could not predict, walking across whichever stretch of slope had men moving on it. What turned the fight was not courage, it was geometry. To bypass a position, you have to know where its fire ends. You have to be able to say, the gun covers from here to here, and everything past that line is safe. Every soldier who tried to draw that line on the slope that night drew it wrong, because the man in the hole would not let his fire settle into a shape. You cannot flank what you cannot locate, and you cannot route the follow-on waves around a threat when you do not know how wide the threat is. And so, the assault, which had all the men it needed and all the nerve it had started with, began to pool at the base of that 30 yards, like water backing up behind a stone. The officers down in the draw were now running a math problem with no good answer. Push straight into the fire again, and lose more of the assault echelon on the open slope with the sky already thinning. Keep hunting for a flank that kept not being there, and spend the minutes they no longer had. Break off and pull back over the reverse slope, and hand back everything the night had bought. Every one of those choices cost time, and time was the one account already overdrawn. The 40 minutes were gone. They were into the part of the night the Doctrine warned about, the part where a Chinese battalion is still on the wrong side of the crest when the light comes, and the regiment behind that man. This is the part he had no way of knowing, was still whole. The flank that was supposed to be rolled up by now was not rolled up. The holes down the line that should have been taken from the side were still manned, still facing the direction they were dug to face because the hinge had not turned. One position that refused to fall silent had frozen an entire sector's worth of attack in place, not by killing everyone. He could not have killed everyone, but by denying the assault, the one thing it had to have to continue, which was a clear picture of where it was safe to move. There is a cold arithmetic in that, and it runs the other way from the arithmetic of Section 5. The Chinese had built their whole method on spending men to buy time, and now a single American was spending their time and giving them no way to buy it back, no target to overwhelm, no flank to slip around, nothing but a stretch of killing ground that stayed lethal no matter how they came at it. The sky kept going gray. The bursts from the finger kept coming, thinner now, more spaced, but coming. And somewhere down in the draw, A decision was forming that no assault commander ever wants to reach. The decision that the crest was not going to be theirs before the sun made staying on that slope a sentence. Zhang Wenbin came up over the lip of the draw one last time, and the light was against him now. Not sunlight, not yet, but that first thin gray that turns a black slope into a field of shapes, and the shapes on the slope in front of him were men who were not moving. He had come up in the second wave near midnight. It was going on 5 hours later, and the thing he noticed, the way he had noticed the silence at the start, was that he could see. That was the disaster. The whole method had been built so that the men would be gone from this exact stretch of ground before there was enough light to see them by, and there was enough light, and they were still on it. The order to break off came down the slope, the way orders come when they are already too late to matter. They went back over the crest they had climbed, and they left the slope the way it was. The record of what that slope looked like at first light does not come to us clean. Chinese units did not file the kind of casualty by position returns that would let you count the dead in front of one hole, and the American side saw the ground only after, in daylight, from their own line. What both sides describe is the same picture from two directions. Bodies grouped on a forward slope, thickest where the approach is funneled toward a single point on the crest. The men lying where the fire had caught them trying to cross 30 yards that would not let them across. The BAR had stopped. Somewhere in the last hour of dark it had gone quiet, and the sources do not agree on why, and I am not going to pretend they do. Out of ammunition, or the barrel finally gone, or the man himself finally hit. The account split 3 ways, and none of them wins. What is not in dispute is that the fire held until the light, and that when the assault pulled back, it pulled back past a position it had never taken. When the relief came up the finger after sunrise, they found the hole. What they found in it, the citations describe in the flat language citations use, and I will not dress it past what the record carries. The man was there. The empty magazines were there, more of them than the arithmetic of one night should have allowed, scattered around the lip where he had worked through them one at a time in the cold. The ground in front of the hole told the rest of it without needing a word added. The last words here are theirs, not mine. In the operational reviews the Chinese command wrote afterward, working through why attacks that should have carried the crest came apart on it. The finding kept coming back to the same shape, stated as cold instruction to their own officers, that a single point of resistance, left alive on the objective, could disrupt the entire timetable of the attack and expose the assault troops to enemy artillery at first light. They wrote that as a warning about a thing that had already happened to them. The proof of the man in the hole is not in the American medal file. It is in the enemy's own after-action note, telling the next set of commanders to make sure it never happened again. It happened again anyway, all along that line, all that winter. The outpost war on the Korean ridges was full of these holes and these nights, positions that were supposed to fall silent and did not, and the reason the Chinese kept writing the same warning is that the Americans kept giving them the same problem. The sun came up over the frozen field. The men who had climbed the slope in the dark were back on their own side of the crest, counting a night that had cost them the one thing they could not replace and had bought them nothing. The finger was still American. The holes down the line, the ones that were supposed to be rolled up like a coat, were still manned and still facing out. And in the hole at the hinge of it all, The weapon that had spent their whole timetable, a burst at a time, had gone quiet at last, in the light, with the field in front of it, doing the only accounting that mattered. By the winter of 1952, the United States Army in Korea was the most materially lavish fighting force the world had ever put in a line. It moved on a river of shells, of sea rations and radio batteries and replacement barrels, of trucks that ran all night on gasoline, hauled from ports built out of nothing. Its whole theory of war was that you did not need one man to be extraordinary, because you had 10,000 men and the factories behind them, and mass would do what heroics used to have to. That was the American way, and it worked, and it had beaten larger armies with fewer casualties precisely by refusing to make the fight depend on any single soldier being irreplaceable. And then, at the hinge of one outpost line on one frozen finger, the entire apparatus came down to exactly that: one man in one hole who would not give it up. There is an irony in it that I do not think the man in the hole would have had any patience for. The army that had industrialized courage, that had tried to engineer the individual stubbornness out of the equation, because stubbornness gets men killed, was saved that night by the one variable it could never manufacture on a production line. It was not the BAR, though the BAR mattered, and it was not the artillery waiting for light, though that mattered too. The thing that held the sector was a decision made inside one skull that the whole was not going to be given up, and there is no factory in Detroit or Bridgeport that stamps that out by the thousand. The Chinese understood this better than we sometimes give them credit for. Their whole method was a wager that no single point could hold long enough to matter, that if you kept feeding men against a line, the line would develop a soft spot and the soft spot would spread. It was a sound wager. It usually paid. What it could not price in was the possibility that the soft spot would refuse to be soft, that one position would simply decline to follow the arithmetic, and that the refusal of one man could invalidate the calculation for an entire battalion. They spent their 40 minutes and then spent an hour they did not have, and they went home over the crest with nothing because the math had a term in it they had left out. Zhang Wenbin. And I want to be honest that his name here stands in for the thousands of men who made that climb on nights like this one, because the individual record of who came up, which draw, does not survive in the form I would want. Zhang Wenbin went back down the reverse slope in the gray light, having learned a thing his officers already suspected, and would keep writing into their reviews all that winter. You could not count on the hole falling silent. Sometimes the hole held. The finger is still there. It is a low ridge in what is now the demilitarized zone, or just south of it, depending on which of these actions you fix the story to, and the ground the men died crossing is grown over with scrub and the kind of grass that comes back over old earthworks, and on a clear day you can see the shape of the old positions if you know what a filled-in fighting hole looks like from 30 feet. Farmers work the valleys below. The line the man held is a contour on a map now, walked by patrols who were born decades after the night the BAR ran hot. I will give the last word to one of the men who came up that finger with the relief at sunrise, who looked into the hole and then out at the slope in front of it, and who said the only thing that has ever seemed to me adequate to it. He was an old man when he said it, and he was not reaching for anything, and the interviewer had asked him whether the position could have been held by anyone else that night. Maybe. I don't know. All I know is the ones who tried to take that hole are still on that hill, and he isn't, and neither am I, and I've thought about that every winter of my life.